A driver cuts you off in traffic and proceeds to honk at you as if it's your fault. Someone is rude to you at a bar. There are two options. Option A: you think both these people are rude personality-wise and they are predisposed to be rude, it's in their personality. Or option B: maybe they're just having a bad day. Maybe the situation and the context had something to do with their behavior and actions. People have a tendency to answer option A. This is called the fundamental attribution error. This is an example of a bias where people overestimate the importance of dispositional personality factors and underestimate the importance of contextual factors. This is just an example of a bias that we all have and that we are usually blind to, as many others that we have. In this video, you will see how naive realism leads us to not see our biases. In essence, to have a bias blind spot. And you will also learn how to see it. My name is Lorenzo, and this is the psychology of everything. Biases are a systematic tendency to think about things in a certain way. As I mentioned in the example I gave, there was an overestimation of the importance of dispositional factors and an underestimation of contextual ones. That is just an example of a bias, and everyone is biased in some ways. And there are a lot of them. Wikipedia lists 203 to be exact. Yeah, I counted them. So, everyone is biased, except me, of course. The bias blind spot is the tendency that people have to say or to think that they are not biased, or when compared to others to think they are less biased than other people. They are blind to their own biases, hence the name. And this is problematic because, as you can imagine, being blind to your own biases leads us to not correct them and to act in biased ways, and ideally we would prefer to act in unbiased ways. Right? We know that the bias blind spot exists because, as you can see in this picture, people, when comparing themselves in the black column with average Americans, white columns, rate themselves as being way less susceptible to biases. But after researchers found that this was something that happened, that people tended to underestimate how biased they were, they tried to understand why that happened. And one of the possibilities that arose was that people, by having a tendency to showcase their good qualities, they would not report their poor ones, like being biased. This is something that is called self-enhancement, and I made a video about it. So they put this to the test. They saw that when it came to procrastination and fear of public speaking, people felt more susceptible than their peers, instead of less susceptible, as was the case with biases. This eliminated the possibility that the bias blind spot was due to self-enhancement, because, as you can imagine, again, both procrastination and fear of public speaking aren't exactly positive things, and therefore they shouldn't be reported as much. So the researchers dismissed this. They found out that it wasn't a self-enhancement tendency and motivation that led to the bias blind spot. So what was it? Well, this is somewhat complex, so it deserves a whole chapter. It's naive realism, by the way. If you think you perceive reality as it is, then you are a naive realist, and in fact, most people are. Naive realism describes the fact that people think, or simply assume without giving the matter any thought at all, that their own take on the world enjoys particular authenticity and will be shared by other open-minded perceivers and seekers of truth. In layman's terms, people believe that the way they perceive the world is correct, and if someone else disagrees with them and questions what they see, then the other people are probably wrong. The other people are biased. But this wouldn't be a problem if biases were perceived, if we had conscious of them, if we could see them. But the problem lies exactly there, because we can't see our biases. They are not visible. In fact, they are almost like a filter. The reality that we perceive is a post-filtration reality. It was already processed by our biases and our tendencies, and so what we see occurs after our biases took effect. And what this means is, although we feel that the reality we are perceiving is correct, what we see, in fact, is that clean and clear post-filtration, post-bias reality that we mistake for the real deal. By the way, if you didn't like this filtration analogy, it's because you're super biased, okay? You're not a rational actor. Bye. Okay, but imagine someone was actually accusing you of being super biased, which is not the case at all here. What would you do? What would be your strategy to try to analyze yourself and to check if that accusation is real? Probably what you would do, and what we all do, would be introspection. Okay, let me analyze my thought process to check for biases. But you can probably see why this doesn't work, because biases, as I mentioned, they aren't apparent through introspection. But we believe we could check for our biases if they were there, as we are naive realists and we believe that what we see corresponds to reality. We would see them through introspection. So, how can we fix it? Have you realized by now that the bias blind spot itself is a kind of bias? And when it comes to biases, I had a professor in college that said we could distinguish them in two broad categories. Those that could be reduced by just knowing about them, by just having knowledge about them, and those who could not. And I honestly admit that at the beginning of this video, before I started researching it, how to fix the bias blind spot, I believe that it fell on the first category. I believe that when I informed you, that would be enough to mitigate it. But to my dismay, that was not the case. Actually, the bias blind spot is one of the toughest biases to get rid of. And even though I scoured numerous articles, there were only two ways that I found that could be slightly effective at dealing with it. The first thing that you need to know is that you're biased. Just knowing that you're biased and being presented evidence that you're biased is enough to reduce slightly the bias blind spot. How do we know this? In one study, people were presented with cognitive problems that would show them that they were biased, and they were presented them either before their bias blind spot was measured or after. And those that solved the problems before and therefore were presented their biases before measuring their bias blind spot had a lesser degree of bias blind spot. This means that being presented with their fallibility and the fact that they were biased helped them mitigate somewhat their bias blind spot. But there's an even more amazing study that basically made people play a game. Yeah, people were presented with a game called Macbeth. Why is it called Macbeth? I have no idea. In Macbeth, players assume the role of an intelligence analyst and are given a series of scenarios describing impending terrorist attacks. And as they make these decisions, they are taught about their biases, and they are scored when their decisions aren't biased. And what the others saw is that the more people played, the less bias blind spot there was. But again, this didn't completely destroy the bias blind spot. What happened is that, yeah, their bias blind spot was somewhat reduced because they were aware of their biases, but not that much. And here is the problem. The bias blind spot seems to be very robust and resistant to change. So how can we deal with it? Well, by not trying to. If you recall, we tend to evaluate if we are biased through our own introspection. But what I hadn't told you is that when we evaluate if other people are biased, we do it through their behaviors, which makes a lot more sense. Some researchers, having realized this, made a brilliant experiment. There were two conditions. In one of them, the researchers asked participants to be objective. When you ask someone to be objective, the instrument through which they will measure it is by their introspection. They will measure and think, okay, are there biases here? And they won't find them, as you know now. But the other condition, what they asked people to do, was to appear objective. Just appear objective. And what that instruction does is that when you are making decisions, instead of relying on your introspection, you will analyze the consequences of your behavior to check if they are biased or not. So you will begin using the strategy that you use to assess other people's biases to your own. And amazingly, when asked to appear objective, people are indeed more objective. So what can we conclude by this? Is that by not trying to solve the bias blind spot, because you can't actually see your biases when you are perceiving reality, is by circumventing it, is by, instead of focusing on seeing your biases, you should analyze your behaviors to check for biased results. And yes, I know that I didn't tell you how to solve the bias blind spot, because in the edge of scientific knowledge right now, there is not an answer to that question. What exists is a possibility for you to have less biased actions, regardless of your bias blind spot. So we are bound to have a bias blind spot. We are bound to be blind to some biases that we have, and that is complemented and brought forth because we tend to be naive realists. We tend to think that what we see is reality as it is. And so the way that we can circumvent and mitigate the consequences of having a bias blind spot is to analyze our biases not through introspection, but through analyzing our behaviors. Take care and see you soon.